They built it for 3 years. Every meter of trench, every minefield, every concrete bunker. Mala Tokmachka was supposed to be the one place Ukraine could never take back. Putin's generals called it impenetrable. His engineers called it a masterpiece. And for 36 months, they were right. Until May 20th, when the entire structure collapsed in less than 72 hours. Here's what nobody's telling you. This wasn't just another village changing hands on some map. This was the single most fortified position on the entire southern front. And Ukraine didn't just crack it. They demolished it using a battle plan so precise, so devastatingly effective, that Russian commanders are still trying to figure out what hit them. And the implications of what just happened stretch all the way to Crimea. To understand why Mala Tokmachka matters, you need to understand what it was protecting. This wasn't some random farm town in the Zaporizhia plains. This was the shield, the lock, the one position standing between Ukrainian forces and the city of Tokmak. And Tokmak isn't just a city, it's the beating heart of Russia's entire southern logistics network. Every tank, every artillery shell, every fresh battalion heading to the front lines in southern Ukraine flows through Tokmak. Russian military doctrine depends on centralized supply hubs, and Tokmak is the biggest one they have. Lose Mala Tokmachka, and suddenly Tokmak is exposed. Lose Tokmak, and the entire land bridge to Crimea starts to crumble. That's why Russia spent 3 years turning Mala Tokmachka into what they thought was an unbreakable fortress. That's why they layered the ground with some of the densest minefields ever documented in modern warfare. That's why they stationed the 58th Combined Arms Army there, backed by elite VDV airborne units and the 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division. They knew what was at stake. Ukraine knew it too. And they tried before. Summer of 2023. That was the first attempt. The plan back then was straightforward. Overwhelming armored force. Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, freshly equipped with German Leopard 2A4 and 2A6 main battle tanks and American Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, was supposed to punch straight through Russian lines. This was the best Ukraine had. Western-trained crews, top-tier equipment, maximum firepower. The theory was solid. Shock and awe. Crush the defenses with sheer armored mass and speed. But theory met reality in the worst possible way. Those minefields were unlike anything NATO doctrine had prepared them for. Russian engineers had created overlapping kill zones so dense that vehicles were getting disabled before they could even engage enemy positions. Ukrainian armor got bogged down, isolated, picked apart. The offensive stalled after advancing just a few kilometers. Losses were heavy. Morale took a hit. And the front line froze again. Mala Tokmachka stayed red on the map. Russia declared victory. Their propaganda machine celebrated the failure of Western weapons. And for a while, it seemed like they were right. But here's what changed. Ukraine didn't just lick its wounds and give up. They studied that failure. Every destroyed tank, every casualty, every tactical mistake. They rebuilt their approach from the ground up. Gone was the doctrine of massed armor charges into prepared defenses. In its place came something far more dangerous. A hybrid model that fused cutting-edge drone technology, electronic warfare, precision artillery, and small, highly mobile infantry units operating with near-total autonomy. This wasn't the Ukrainian military of 2023. This was a completely evolved fighting force. And when they came back to Mala Tokmachka in May of 2025, the Russians didn't stand a chance. This time, the 47th Mechanized Brigade wasn't leading the charge. That honor went to the 118th Mechanized Brigade. And the operation didn't start with artillery barrages or tank columns. It started in silence. Ukrainian drone operators launched reconnaissance flights over Mala Tokmachka, using thermal and optical sensors so advanced they could map every Russian position in three-dimensional detail. Every command post, every hidden artillery battery, every ammunition stockpile, every camouflaged logistics hub, everything. This wasn't guesswork. This was surgical intelligence gathering. And once they had that map, they handed it over to Ukraine's electronic warfare units. That's when things got brutal. The moment those jamming systems powered up, every Russian radio frequency in Mala Tokmachka went dark. Communication between forward units and rear command centers was severed instantly. Russian troops couldn't call for artillery support, couldn't report enemy movements, couldn't coordinate a defense. In military terms, they were operationally isolated, blind, deaf, paralyzed, and that's exactly when Ukrainian artillery opened fire. But this wasn't random shelling. Every single round was guided. Every target had been pre-selected based on that drone intelligence. Ukrainian gunners weren't aiming at trenches. They were aiming at the Russian army's central nervous system, communication nodes, electronic warfare vehicles, ammunition depots. The kind of targets that, when destroyed, don't just kill soldiers. They collapse entire command structures. And they hit them all. Within hours, Russian forces in Mala Tokmachka had lost their ability to function as a coordinated military unit. That's when Ukrainian mechanized infantry moved in. Small teams, fast, adaptive, trained in urban warfare. They didn't try to steamroll the defenses, they infiltrated, isolated Russian strongpoints, neutralized them one by one. The Russian numerical advantage meant nothing, because they couldn't organize a coherent response. Panic set in. Units started retreating without orders, and then the retreat turned into a rout. The 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division, one of Russia's most experienced units, couldn't hold the line. The 71st and 290th Motorized Rifle Regiments suffered catastrophic losses and abandoned their positions. Even the VDV, Russia's so-called elite airborne forces, couldn't stop the collapse. These are units that pride themselves on discipline and toughness, and they fled. By May 20th, Ukrainian forces had secured not just Mala Tokmachka, but also the neighboring settlement of Bilohirya, two key positions, gone. And with them, Russia's entire defensive structure in the region shattered. For the first time in 3 years, the blue and yellow flag was flying over Mala Tokmachka again. But that wasn't the end of the operation. That was just the beginning of the nightmare for Russian logistics. Because taking Mala Tokmachka gave Ukraine something far more valuable than a symbolic victory. It gave them control of the T-0815 highway. This isn't just any road. This is one of the main arteries feeding Russian forces across the southern front. And now it's within Ukrainian artillery range. More importantly, Mala Tokmachka sits on elevated terrain that overlooks a massive stretch of open farmland extending south. Ukrainian forces can now position surveillance systems, electronic warfare equipment, and drone launch platforms with an unobstructed view of everything happening for kilometers in every direction. And right in the middle of that view sits Tokmak. The city Russian logistics cannot function without. Every ammunition convoy, every fuel truck, every troop rotation heading to the front has to pass through or near Tokmak. And now Ukraine can see it all. They can target it all. Russian commanders are faced with an impossible choice. Either keep using Tokmak and accept that their supply lines are under constant threat of drone strikes and artillery fire, or abandon it and try to reroute their entire logistics network through longer, slower, more vulnerable roads. Neither option is good. Both options bleed resources. But the pressure isn't just on Tokmak. Ukraine is simultaneously choking off the alternative routes Russia has been relying on. The R-280 highway, the main supply line running from Rostov-on-Don all the way down to Crimea through occupied Mariupol and Berdyansk, has become a killing field. Ukrainian FPV drones and autonomous attack systems are hunting Russian military vehicles along that highway with terrifying efficiency. Fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, troop transports, all of them are targets, and Ukraine is hitting them. The impact has been so severe that Volodymyr Saldo, the head of the Russian-installed administration in occupied Kherson, was forced to issue an emergency order on May 21st. He banned all civilian truck traffic on a 30-kilometer stretch of the R-280 highway between the 463rd and 494th kilometer markers. That section runs straight toward Jankoy, the gateway to Crimea. Only approved military convoys are allowed through now. Think about what that means. Russia is so worried about losing vehicles to Ukrainian drones that they've shut down civilian logistics on their own supply route. That's not normal wartime procedure. That's desperation. That's an admission that they've lost control of their own rear areas. And it gets worse for Moscow. Because this isn't just about one highway or one city. This is about the entire architecture of Russia's southern campaign. Russian military strategy has always been built on railways, heavy equipment, massive ammunition stockpiles, armored vehicles. All of it moves by rail. The railway line running through Tokmak to Melitopol and onward to Crimea is the backbone of that system. If Ukraine can interdict that rail line, either by direct strikes or by making the area too dangerous to operate in, then Russia's ability to sustain large-scale operations across the southern front collapses. They'd be forced to rely entirely on truck convoys, which are slower, more vulnerable, and require exponentially more resources to move the same amount of cargo. One train can carry what hundreds of trucks carry. Lose the trains, and the entire logistics equation falls apart. And that's exactly the situation Russia is staring at right now. Ukrainian forces aren't just sitting on their new positions in Mala Tokmachka. They're fortifying. They're expanding reconnaissance. They're preparing for the next phase. Because this operation was never just about taking one town. It was about creating a springboard, a launch point for deeper operations. And the most obvious target is staring everyone in the face: Melitopol, the city that connects the land bridge between mainland Russia and occupied Crimea. Melitopol is the logistical, administrative, and political center of that land bridge. It's the hub that makes Russia's control of Crimea sustainable by land. If Ukraine can sever that connection, Crimea becomes an island again. And islands are much harder to defend when the enemy controls the surrounding sea and can strike your supply lines at will. Russia knows this. That's why they've been pouring resources into defending Melitopol. But those resources have to come from somewhere. And every unit pulled from the Eastern Front to shore up the south is a unit that's not fighting in Donetsk or Luhansk. Every artillery battery repositioned to protect Tokmak is a battery that's not supporting offensive operations elsewhere. Ukraine is forcing Russia into a defensive crouch, and in a war of attrition, the side that's reacting instead of acting is the side that's losing. There's another dimension to this that's easy to miss if you're just looking at maps. This operation in Mala Tokmachka represents a fundamental shift in how Ukraine is fighting this war. The failed offensive of 2023 was a wake-up call. It forced Ukrainian commanders to accept a hard truth. They couldn't outmuscle Russia. They didn't have the manpower or the industrial base to win a purely conventional slugging match. So they adapted. They leaned into asymmetric advantages: drones, electronic warfare, precision strikes, decentralized command, small unit tactics. They turned themselves into a force that could operate inside Russia's decision-making cycle. By the time Russian commanders realized what was happening, Ukrainian units had already moved to the next objective. That's why the 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division collapsed. That's why the VDV couldn't hold. It wasn't a lack of courage or training. It was a lack of information and coordination. Ukraine controlled the electromagnetic spectrum. They controlled the intelligence picture. And in modern warfare, the side that controls information controls the battlefield. Now imagine this playing out across the entire southern front over the next few months. Ukrainian forces continue to pressure Tokmak. Russian logistics become more strained. Supply convoys get hit. Railway lines get interdicted. Ammunition runs low. Morale drops. Units get shuffled around to plug gaps. And while all that's happening, Ukraine is gathering intelligence. Watching, waiting, looking for the next weak point. The next Mala Tokmaka. And when they find it, they'll strike again. This is how you win a war of attrition when you're the smaller force. You don't try to break the enemy everywhere at once. You break them piece by piece. You make them bleed resources. You make them chase you. You make every kilometer of occupied territory a liability instead of an asset. And eventually, the math stops working for them. So what does this mean for Crimea? That's the question everyone's asking. Because if Ukraine can continue this momentum, if they can push through Tokmak and reach Melitopol, then the land bridge is cut. And if the land bridge is cut, Russia's position in Crimea becomes untenable. Not immediately. Russia still has the Kerch Bridge. They still have air and sea routes, but those routes are already under pressure. The Kerch Bridge has been hit before. It can be hit again, and if Russia loses the ability to reinforce and resupply Crimea by land, then every soldier, every tank, every artillery shell on that peninsula becomes a wasting asset. Ukraine doesn't even have to invade Crimea at that point. They just have to wait, interdict supplies, launch long-range strikes, make it too costly for Russia to hold. And eventually Moscow has to make a choice. Pour even more resources into a losing position, or cut their losses. Neither option is politically palatable for Putin. But wars aren't won by politics. They're won by logistics. And right now, Ukraine is winning the logistics fight in the south. There's one more thing worth considering: the psychological impact. For 3 years, Mala Tokmachka was a symbol of Russian strength, a symbol that Ukraine couldn't break through. Russian propaganda used it as proof that Western weapons didn't matter, that Ukrainian tactics couldn't overcome Russian fortifications. And now it's gone. Taken in 72 hours. That's not just a military defeat. That's a narrative collapse. Every Russian soldier on the southern front now knows that the impenetrable fortress wasn't impenetrable. Every Russian commander now has to recalculate their assumptions about what Ukraine can and can't do. And every Ukrainian soldier now has proof that the strategy works, that adaptation works, that they can win. Morale is a weapon, and Ukraine just gained a massive amount of it while Russia lost the same. So where does this go from here? Ukraine has two paths. The first is to consolidate, fortify Mala Tokmachka and the surrounding areas. Use it as a defensive bastion and continue interdicting Russian logistics from a position of strength. The second is to press the advantage. Push toward Tokmak before Russia can regroup. Force them to fight on ground that favors Ukrainian tactics. And if Tokmak falls, then the path to Melitopol opens. That's the high-risk, high-reward option. It's also the option that could end the war in the south. Because if Ukraine cuts the land bridge, Russia's entire strategic position in southern Ukraine becomes unsustainable. They'd be holding territory they can't supply, fighting a war they can't win, and facing a choice between humiliating withdrawal or catastrophic defeat. The fall of Mala Tokmachka isn't just a tactical victory. It's a signal. A signal that the static front lines everyone assumed would last forever can break. That Russia's defensive doctrine has fatal flaws. That Ukraine has figured out how to exploit those flaws. And that the war in the south is no longer frozen. It's moving. And it's moving in Ukraine's favor. The question now isn't whether Ukraine can take back occupied territory. The question is how far they can push before Russia's logistics network collapses entirely. And judging by what just happened in Tokmak, that collapse might be closer than anyone thought.